Hello, everyone. For those who don't know, my name is McKenna Bates, and I'm a camera fellow at George Mason University. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker, Alex Safian. Alex Safian is the Associate Director of CAMERA, which is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the San Diego Tribune, the Jerusalem Post, Newsmax.com, National Review Online, Middle East Quarterly, and other newspapers and academic journals. He's lectured widely on media coverage of the Middle East and related issues. Safian is the author of the monograph PBS and Israel, A Pattern of Bias, The Case of the Journey to the Occupied Lands, and testified before an appropriations subcommittee of the U.S. Congress regarding bias in PBS and NPR programming. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him so he can give some remarks and introduce himself.
Well, great. Thanks very much, McKenna. I'm very happy to be here with you. Thanks to you and thanks to your team at George Mason for setting this up. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, maybe, just as an introduction, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have lots of questions that have been submitted by folks in the audience and by McKenna's team, and I've got a few myself that I will ask and try to answer that I think are relevant. Now, the place I'd like to start is the entire question of judging Israel or judging any country, or even judging a person. How do you judge? If you start out by comparing to ideal standards, then everyone is going to come out looking very bad. So one of the ways that some people ensure that Israel looks bad is by comparing Israel to some ideal, non-existent country that follows international law in every way imaginable, that never does anything that could even be portrayed as wrong, etc. If you do that, then you guarantee that Israel is going to come out looking bad, or any country is going to come out looking bad. If you do that to your friends will come out looking bad if you compare them to ideal standards. Ideal standards are called ideal because they don't exist in real life. So whether it's done intentionally or not, it's something that really cannot be allowed to pass unrefuted, and that is, don't allow ideal standards. No country looks good under ideal standards. So related to that, as I mentioned, is the whole question of international law. And does Israel follow international law? Is Israel guilty of violating international law? I would say that no country follows international law, and that Israel, in fact, does a better job of following international law than any country, any other country in the world, especially, again, if you don't look at ideal standards. If you don't compare, say, Israel under attack by Hamas rockets, by Hamas missiles, by suicide bombers in the streets, on the buses, in the schools, if you don't compare that Israel under attack to Norway at peace, right, or Iceland at peace. Lots of people make that mistake or try that either intentionally or unintentionally. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. The only fair comparison is Israel under attack versus other Western democracies under attack, because that's the standard that Israel holds itself to, is other Western democracies. So how does Israel compare to, say, the United States under attack, or to Great Britain or France under attack? So one example, if you look at, say, World War II, and the United States having been attacked by the Japanese Empire, for example, in, I guess it was 1941, versus Israel, say, which became independent in 1948. That's a fair comparison because that's more or less the same era historically. Now, what the United States did when we were attacked by Japan is we took Japanese American citizens, some of them fourth generation citizens, and put them into concentration camps, not death camps by any means, but we put them into rather rough camps. We evacuated them from their homes on the West Coast mostly, and put them into camps, not just on the West Coast, but distributed around the country, including in like Nebraska and stuff, and confiscated their property. because we were afraid that Japan was going to invade our West Coast, which really they were thousands of miles away. That was not really very realistic fear, but that's what we did. Under the fear and under the exigencies of war, that is what we did. Israel's never done anything like that. Even after 1948, having been attacked by surrounding Arab countries, Israel did not expel the Arabs who remained in Israel at the end of the war. Those people stayed on. They were Israeli citizens. They lived under, if they lived on the border, they lived under military rule because of the threat of further attacks and infiltrations, etc. But that was rather minimal compared to what the United States did with under far less threat, right? Israel, a tiny country surrounded by hostile countries, a newborn country, a newly reborn country, really, having been invaded, having been attacked. The United States was not invaded, and yet we did that. Israel had been invaded and had to force back the invaders. It faced an existential threat, and yet didn't do that. So that's why I say that whenever you make a real world comparison of Israel versus other Western democracies, Israel comes out looking very, very good. If you compare Israel to Iceland at peace, maybe not so much, but that's not a fair comparison. And it's not a fair comparison to compare Israel to some ideal standard of a country that does not exist. The last thing I guess I'll go through in my remarks before we open it up to questions is a question that I've often heard. And that is, well, it's not really a question, it's a statement you often hear that the illegal Israeli occupation, is the Israeli occupation, quote unquote, illegal? So let's pull the camera back a little bit. Are occupations illegal? Not just the Israeli occupation, such as it is, but occupations in general, are they illegal? For example, again, let's go back to World War II. When the United States Army crossed the sovereign borders of Germany during World War II and entered into sovereign German territory and began to occupy German territory on its drive towards Berlin, was that an illegal occupation? Was the United States obligated to turn around once it crossed Germany's border and go back to Germany's borders? And the answer is obviously not. That to pose the question is to see how ridiculous it is. That was not illegal. And the US occupation and Russian and British occupations of Germany after World War II were not illegal. Occupations per se are not illegal. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan after the Six-Day War were not, in general, per se, illegal. In fact, we can get into it maybe a little later, but Israel actually had, in distinction to, say, the United States or the UK or Russia in Germany, Israel actually had a claim to title in the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, they had a legal right to be there even before they entered there on the basis of the Palestine Mandate and other pieces of international law. The Israelis had a right to be there, even though they were not there before '67. They had sovereignty claims of their own, in other words. In fact, some will argue that Israel had the strongest sovereignty claims in the West Bank and Gaza as compared to anybody else, as compared to Egypt or as compared to Jordan, who had previously held Gaza and the West Bank, respectively. So it's an important thing to note. You hear it over and over again, the illegal Israeli occupation, but it is not illegal. It has never been illegal. And occupations in general are not illegal, especially when they result from a defensive war, as the occupations of Germany did, and as the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, to the extent they were even occupations, they were not illegal. Okay, I think I will leave it at that and we'll move on to questions. So I guess maybe McKenna's muted. I don't know. There we go.
Yes, sorry, technology. Awesome. So thank you so much. Again, we're honored to have you here. I'll get into some questions. I do have a list of questions that were submitted ahead of time. However, if you do feel that you have a question that I've missed or something that's really burning you up, feel free to submit it with the Q&A feature, and it'll be sent to us, and then we can ask the question if we have time. So our first question is, isn't there media censorship in Israel? How can it be a true democracy if people aren't allowed to speak against the government?
Well, interesting question. The idea that the Israeli media is not allowed to speak against the government can only provoke laughter from anyone who's familiar with Israel or the Israeli media. I cannot think of any media in the world that is more critical of its own government. And so I would invite everyone listening, everyone watching here, to just go to the website of Haaretz, which is kind of the New York Times of Israel, except it has a very small circulation compared to other newspapers in Israel, but it is kind of the newspaper of the elites. It publishes both in English and in Hebrew, so you can go to it's Haaretz, so just Google that, go to the website, look at the English language version, look at the Hebrew version, just do Google Translate, and you will see nothing but criticism of Bibi Netanyahu, just pages after pages of criticism of every single aspect of Bibi Netanyahu and of the Likud. There's a joke in Israel that if Bibi Netanyahu went down to the Sea of Galilee and walked on water, the headline in Haaretz the next day would be, Bibi can't swim. That's about the level of criticism of the government in Israel. And the same thing is true in other newspapers. You go to Ynet, Y-N-E-T, that is the online version of Yediot, which is one of the largest newspapers in Israel. They have a very large circulation on the order of 600,000 or 700,000. So that's a big newspaper period for any country. Very, very critical of Netanyahu. And the other papers as well. The only exception is Israel Hayom, which is a new newspaper in Israel, which tends to be fairly favorable towards Netanyahu and the Likud. But the idea that the media cannot criticize the government in Israel is just, that's a new one. I've never heard that before. And I invite anyone, don't take my word for it, just get on the internet and you'll see for yourself. There is still military censorship in Israel, but it's very, very limited in the sense that I'll give you an example of where military censorship came into play, and that is during the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was firing Scud missiles into Israel, some in the Israeli media were reporting on the scene where the missiles were hitting. And that was kind of dumb of them because they were basically acting as target spotters for the Iraqis. If the Iraqis knew where their missiles were hitting, they can adjust the aim to try to hit a more high value or populated target. So the Israeli military censor got involved and said, you cannot report in real time where the missiles are landing. That's the example of military censorship in Israel. It's minor, and there are always ways around it. In the past, when the military censor has been kind of annoying for the media, what the Israeli media does is they simply leak the information that they want to report. If, for instance, some scandal in the Israeli Defense Forces, say, and the military censor says, no, you can't report that. So the Israeli journalists just leak it to their American friends, and then it ends up in the New York Times or the Washington Post. And then the military censor doesn't matter because then the Israeli press says, according to foreign sources, and they just report what they wanted to report anyhow. So that's the way they always got around that kind of military censorship. It's basically faded away now to nothing. It still would apply if there were rockets hitting and reports. For instance, Al Jazeera was doing this as well. They would report where missiles were landing in Israel. And so the Israelis tried to get them to stop doing that because that is something in real time acting as a target spotter that they don't want to allow. But there is no censorship, certainly. I mean, the Israeli media is the furthest thing from censored of any media you could think of in the world.
Fantastic. All right, the second question is, why didn't Israel hold up its end of the Oslo Accords?
Well, I think the assumption there is that Israel didn't hold up its end of the Oslo Accords. I would say that if you just look at the Oslo Accords, they're all on the web again, and you can read the analysis by people who are pro-Israel, people who are pro-Palestinian. I would say the bottom line is this. The fundamental things that the Oslo Accords called for from the Palestinians were no more terrorism. right? No more attacks, no more suicide bombings, no more missiles, no more shooting attacks of the kinds that we saw in the first Intifada. None of those attacks. The Oslo Accords set up a Palestinian government under the Palestinian Authority. The Oslo Accords created the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority was supposed to have a monopoly on the use of force. And one of the fundamental things about being a country and being sovereign is the government has to have a monopoly on the use of force. So only the government has guns and has police and has an army. And the government then can rule, benignly or not benignly, but the government has to have a monopoly on the use of force. And so it specifically, the Oslo Accord specifically said that all militias had to be disarmed, meaning Hamas and Islamic Jihad could continue to exist as political entities, but not as militias, not with arms, not with guns, not with mortars, not with bombs. And this is a standard sort of requirement in any peace treaty. For instance, when Britain reached an agreement, the Good Friday Agreement with the IRA, one of the major parts of that was called decommissioning, meaning the IRA had to give up all of its arms. The IRA would have to operate as a political party, which it already had in Sinn Féin, but it would have to give up its arms. It could not continue to attack anybody. So it's perfectly standard that when you make a peace treaty, the armed militias have to disarm, and you make a peace treaty with some other government, right, that you're dealing with. So that was what Israel did with the Palestinian Authority. So did the Palestinian Authority fight terrorism? Did they disarm Hamas? Did they disarm Islamic Jihad? The answer is absolutely not. You just look at the history after the beginning of the Palestinian Authority, the beginning of the Oslo Accords, and you see so many terrorist bombings, right? You see the second Intifada, you see just huge numbers of terrorist bombings in Israel, suicide bombings, killing huge numbers of people, killing 30 people at a time. And let's do a comparison of the Israeli population versus the US population. It's a factor, now it's a factor of maybe 40 to 1, something like that. So if 100 people get killed in terrorist attacks in Israel, that's bigger than 9/11 in the United States in relative terms. Israel went through multiple versions of 9/11 at the hands of Palestinian terrorists. So that was the major violation of the Oslo Accords. The Palestinians simply Arafat never lived up to the requirement of cracking down on terrorism. He made a show every now and then, but it was basically a revolving door. He'd arrest a few terrorists, and then he would let them go immediately. It was just for show because he was getting criticized by the United States and by the Europeans. So he would put on a show of making a few symbolic arrests and then letting them go immediately. He never cracked down on Hamas, Islamic Jihad. He used them. Those were his tools to pressure the Israelis. If he didn't get what he wanted, he would unleash the terrorist bombings, which he would then, say, well, it wasn't me, it was Hamas. Yes, but he was supposed to crack down on Hamas. So it was the Palestinians, unfortunately, who never lived up to Oslo and violated it in its most important aspects, which led to the failure of Oslo.
Awesome. Well, not awesome, but moving on. So the next question is, I've heard that there are Jewish-only roads in the West Bank. Are there really roads that only Jews can use?
Well, I will be happy to answer that. I'll want to especially use my PowerPoint presentation, which I will try to get to share. Let's see. So here we go. This is a presentation I put together on this question of Jewish-only roads. I hope everyone can see this okay. This is the gas station, the main gas station on Route 443. Before I get into this, let me just answer the question. The answer is no. There are no Jewish-only roads in the West Bank or in Israel or anywhere else in any of the areas controlled by Israel. There are no Jewish-only roads. There are roads that are Israeli-only, more or less. But Israeli-only includes Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, Israeli, every other religion present in Israel, Israeli atheists, whatever. So this is a picture that I took on Route 443, one of these supposedly Jewish-only roads. This is the main gas station. You can see the signs both in Hebrew and in Arabic. It turns out that that station, in fact, is jointly owned by a partnership of a Jewish man and an Arab man. I don't know if he's Muslim or Christian, so I don't say either way, but an Arab man and a Jewish man jointly own this gas station. Here is a picture, not a great picture, I apologize, of an Arab woman shopping for something in that gas station. Here is a picture of two things. Number one, you can see the Jeep, three things. You can see the Jeep on the left from the IDF. You can see an Israeli car in the center, and then you can see a bus, a van, really, on the upper left there, or upper center. You see a van. Now, the van is a Palestinian van from the Palestinian Authority carrying Palestinians into Israel. So the so-called Jewish-only roads allow Palestinian vans, even if they don't allow Palestinian cars to travel on this road. And I'll get to a moment as to why that might be. But you can see that Palestinians are able to travel on the road in these Palestinian-owned vans. And let's get a close-up on the car. You'll see that this is an Israeli-Arab family in the car. Let me see if I want to go one more forward. So I wanted to go a little further on this question of Jewish-only roads in Israel. There aren't Jewish-only roads in Israel. However, in Saudi Arabia, there are Muslim-only roads. The holiest site for Islam is the Hejaz, the province where you see Mecca and Medina. So here's a very helpful street sign, a highway sign in Arabic and in English, and it says Muslims only. You don't see anything like that in Israel. You don't see signs that say Jews only. But in Saudi Arabia, the holiest places for Islam, you see signs that say Muslims only. Let's go forward. You can see again, Muslims only, and on the right, obligatory for non-Muslims. You have to take the cutoff to go to Riyadh. You cannot go to Mecca. Now here is a screen grab from the Saudi government website, and if you look towards the bottom, there's an arrow. It may be small type, but it says by that arrow, towards the bottom of the screen, Mecca and Medina hold special religious significance and only persons of the Islamic faith are allowed entry. So further confirmation that you have in the holiest places for Islam, Muslims only. In the holiest places for Jews, which is the Temple Mount, it's the Jews who are restricted. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. I don't want to go on too long, but in Jerusalem, which is the holiest city for Jews, there are no restrictions. You have Muslims, you have Christians, you have people from every corner of the world normally traveling there because it's a great tourist site. There are no such restrictions, period. So I'll stop the screen share right now and we can get on to the next question.
Okay. The next question I had actually never heard of, and it's about the Balfour Declaration. Why do Zionists celebrate Arthur Balfour when he was a European colonist who supported mass murders and colonization of Black people in South Africa? Do you believe the good of Balfour signing the Balfour document, or the Balfour Declaration, outweighs the bad in his decision to support Rhodes's mass murders of Black people? It's a big one.
Yes, Arthur Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary back in those days, 1930s or something, 20s really, 20s, and before that. And he was not actually a supporter of the Zionist project in the Palestine Mandate. However, he was the Foreign Secretary. So when the British government published its declaration in support of a Jewish national home in this territory that was formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, his name was attached to it. But so had Arthur Smith been the Foreign Secretary, it would have been the Smith Declaration, not the Balfour Declaration. So there's no connection between Arthur Balfour's support for South Africa or apartheid or anything else he did and Israel. It just happened to be named the Balfour Declaration. However, that opens up a separate question, which again, I'm going to go to a PowerPoint and There we go. The leader of the Palestinian national movement, the founder of the Palestinian national movement, was the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, pictured on your left. From a famous Jerusalem family, the Husseinis. Yasser Arafat used to claim that he was related to them. I think he actually was not, but he claimed that he was related to the Husseini family. And this is this Grand Mufti. And who is he sitting with? I'm sure most of you recognize who that is. That is Adolf Hitler, the founder of the Nazi Party, the German dictator, one of the worst persons perhaps in the history of the world, the person who carried out the Holocaust against the Jews and Gypsies and many other people. So there was a close connection between the founder of the Palestinian national movement and the Nazis. In fact, the Mufti spent the war in Berlin working with the Nazis. The Mufti put together a Muslim SS division. The SS were the worst of the German forces. And he put together, you can see they're wearing fezzes. So they're in German uniforms, but wearing fezzes because they were a Muslim SS division, which committed terrible war crimes in the Balkans. The Mufti was indicted as a Nazi war criminal after the war by the post-war Yugoslavian government, but unfortunately, some other European governments, for reasons of state, allowed him to escape. In fact, helped him to escape to Egypt after the war. So he escaped justice. I won't go into some of the Mufti's actual activities. I have it here if you want to come to it later. I won't get into that. But the Balfour question does not really say anything about Israel, but a similar question about the Palestinians does not have such a nice answer. The fact is that the Palestinian national movement is directly implicated in the final solution in the Holocaust and had direct ties to the Nazis.
Truly unfortunate. So we have a bunch of questions flooding in, so I want to make sure that I get to those. So our first one is from anonymous attendee. How do we reconcile Zionism with Arab nationalism, considering for much of the Arab-Israeli conflict, both of these ideologies have butted heads?
Well, it's true. I mean, you can't deny that there are conflicts between Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. Arab national, I should say. Well, actually, that's true. Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism do have conflicts. And there's also a conflict with Israeli nationalism, with the Zionist movement. But what we should remember is that there was, this whole question of a Jewish state and of what to do with the Palestine mandate, the mandate for Palestine, was eventually submitted to the United Nations. When the British threw up their hands, they had received the Palestine mandate after World War I. And it turned out to be very, very difficult for them to reconcile the promises they made to the Jews and the fact that the Arabs were not happy about those promises. They found that they couldn't reconcile those two things. And so they threw up their hands and they turned it over to the United Nations after World War II. And the UN eventually came up with a compromise. And that compromise was that there would be this is UN Resolution 181, the partition resolution, that there would be a Jewish state and an Arab state formed out of the Palestine mandate. That was the reconciliation between Jewish nationalism and Palestinian nationalism, that there would be two states created living side by side, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state or an Arab state. And there were lines drawn, there were maps, and it was a very, very difficult compromise for the Jews to accept because it was just so much less than they had been promised in the first place. I want to point out that originally the Palestine mandate, meant for a Jewish national home, included Jordan. In 1922, the British, as was their right under the terms of the Palestine mandate, lopped off Jordan, 80% of the Palestine mandate, and created an Arab state of Transjordan, as it was called in those days. The Jews were left only with 20%, and that was not all Jewish, of course. There were many Arabs living there as well. And then it was further divided for the partition resolution, the Jews were getting even less than the 20%. But they accepted, in part because after the Holocaust and after the end of World War II, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews in displaced persons camps who had been liberated from the from death camps, et cetera, and had hid from the Nazis, some of them, not in death camps, but had successfully hid from the Nazis. And they had no place else to go. They had no intention of going back to their former countries where they were not welcome. They wanted to come to Israel. And so in order to settle the situation, to become a sovereign country, the Jews accepted, the Jewish agency accepted the partition resolution. The Arabs all rejected the partition resolution. The Arab countries that were part of the UN, I think there were 5 of them at the time, if not 6, rejected the partition resolution and promised that if the partition resolution were carried out, that they would immediately attack and destroy Israel. And the Palestinians said the same. So the reason that there wasn't a Palestinian state created 72 years ago was because while the Jews accepted the partition resolution, the Arab countries and the Palestinians rejected it, rejected the formation of a Palestinian state, and started a war. And much to their surprise, they lost the war. That's why. So that would have been the reconciliation of Jewish nationalism and Palestinian or Arab nationalism would have been a compromise. But the Arabs rejected the compromise. And so the unfortunate history since then is all because of that cardinal fact.
Awesome. We have another question, also from an anonymous attendee, but I'm thinking it's probably a different anonymous attendee. Whether or not there is current legal precedent for occupancy, should there not be a personal moral stance factored in?
I guess he means occupation.
I think so, yes.
Yes. So could you let's repeat the question with occupation in there. So
whether or not there is a current legal precedent for occupation, should there not be a personal moral stance factored in?
Well, countries usually don't pay attention to morality. I think Israel actually does more than other countries, and sometimes it doesn't make much sense to the extent that they do that. But Israel has tried to settle the conflict numerous times. Israel has tried to end anything you could call the occupation many, many times, right? In 1948, they tried to avoid going to war, and they wanted a creation of a Palestinian state, or they agreed to the creation of a Palestinian state. And the Arabs turned it down, as I said. After the 1967 war, when the Arabs once again failed to destroy Israel, as Moshe Dayan, the defense minister at the time, said, that was the guy with the famous, the eye patch, the famous Israeli military leader and later foreign minister. He said, I'm waiting by my phone, because he thought that, well, the Arabs must now be convinced that they're not going to be able to destroy Israel. So they will reconcile themselves to the idea that the only way to deal with Israel is by talking, because to that point, the Arabs had refused to talk to Israel in any way. But he waited by his phone. It was very futile, because a few months later, there was an Arab summit meeting in Khartoum, the famous Khartoum summit meeting, in which the Arabs passed a resolution of 3 no's: no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. That's what they said. Absolutely, we lost the war, but we don't have to make peace. We don't have to accommodate. So they passed the 3 no's, and the conflict continued. So we can then, fast forward to the Oslo process, where again, or even go to the Madrid process in 1993, when the Arab states and Israel met in Madrid under the auspices of the United States, United Nations, European powers, et cetera, and tried to reach some kind of accommodation. And again, the Arabs really refused to reach any kind of accommodation, or even go back to the original Camp David process under President Jimmy Carter, where Egypt and Israel made peace. President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin, together with Jimmy Carter, reached a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. As part of that, the Palestinians were included under an autonomy plan. The PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, under that man again, Yasser Arafat, going back to 1980, refused and said absolutely not. Egypt was suspended from the Arab League because it dared to make peace with Israel. And the PLO started assassinating, any Palestinians who would agree to deal with the Israelis under the autonomy plan that President Carter and Begin and Sadat had agreed upon. So I think whether you look at it legally or morally, I don't think Israel comes out looking very bad. On the contrary, Israel has tried again and again and again to reach a reasonable compromise with the Palestinians and put an end to the conflict. Unfortunately, to this point, the Palestinians really have not reciprocated. I always like to say, I mentioned President Sadat, the Egyptian leader who risked his life and ended up getting assassinated a year or 2 later, 2 years later, I think, for peace. He said it when he went to the Israeli Knesset. He said he doesn't want another Egyptian soldier to die, not one Egyptian soldier to die. Let's reach peace. If there were a Palestinian Sadat, then there could be peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and this conflict could finally be over. There has to be a Palestinian leader who is willing to take the ultimate risk for peace, as did Yitzhak Rabin, as did Anwar Sadat, as did Menachem Begin, etc. So far, there has not been that Palestinian leader, unfortunately.
I think the next question also ties into that, and I think you got into it a little bit, but why doesn't Israel just end the conflict tomorrow by withdrawing from the West Bank and ending the blockade on Gaza?
Well, that's a sort of, facile reading of history, because the conflict started before Israel was in the West Bank. The conflict started before Israel was in Gaza. They pulled out of Gaza, of course. But the PLO started in 1964. Fatah, which is the main component of the PLO, founded again run by that man, Yasser Arafat, was founded in the 1950s. So the question has never been really Israeli occupation, quote unquote, of those lands, of the West Bank and Gaza. The question has been Israel's very existence. That's the thing that the Arab countries truly have to reconcile themselves to. If Israel Israel pulled out of Gaza entirely, what happened? Well, in less than a year, Hamas overthrew the Palestinian Authority violently and escalated its attacks against Israel. And we saw, increasingly sophisticated rockets, many of them supplied by Iran through the tunnels from Egypt into Gaza, some of them supplied by the sea. It's very hard to keep these things out entirely. So we saw all kinds of missiles being fired into Israel. We saw rockets being fired. We saw tunnels being dug under the border, attack tunnels from Gaza into Israel. So the idea that if Israel pulls out, that means there's peace just is contradicted by history. And there's little question that if Israel pulled out entirely from the West Bank, 2 things would happen. Hamas would again overthrow the Palestinian Authority, and that would be the end of the Palestinian Authority. They would be in exile if they existed at all. Hamas would be running the West Bank, and they would be attacking Israel, but now with a much, much longer border, and within, a mile of, for instance, Israel's main airport at Ben Gurion Airport. So there'd be mortar fire on Ben Gurion Airport, which would guarantee an Israeli invasion of the West Bank and a reoccupation. So right now, Israel pulling out of the West Bank would exacerbate the conflict. It would guarantee war. It would not bring peace.
Awesome. So just a lot of questions just came in. Okay. So I think, wow, I don't know how to choose from these. I think the first one is also from anonymous attendee. Seems like they have so many of those. How do you discern between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Well, it's a good question. It's not always easy. If you're applying standards that apply, if you're anti-Zionist based on standards that apply only to Jews and no other nationality, then that's anti-Semitism. I think that's the simplest way of putting it. If you don't have a problem with Palestinian nationalism, but you have a problem with Jewish nationalism, in other words, if you're against Israel, but you're in favor of a Palestinian state, then, you know, the question is why? Why are Jews being treated differently than any other people in the world, including Palestinian people? As I said, Israel has agreed to a Palestinian state. So if Israel can agree to a Palestinian state, why can't you agree to a Jewish state? That's what I would ask the anti-Zionists.
Okay. I think the next one is, again, also from an anonymous attendee. If Israel is in the worst position to negotiate for peace and deems it necessary to have the moral high ground, then what incentive is there for Palestine to come to the table and settle rather than let Israel eventually fall on the moral sword on the global stage? Let me see if I can. Oh, it went away. Hold on. Yeah, that's the question. Yeah, okay, I have it.
Quite sure. I guess the question seems to be that if, and it's not the case, but if Israel were losing the moral battle or the PR battle around the world, and on that basis was going to be, say that they were going to be treated like apartheid South Africa and boycotted, etc., then what incentive is there for the Palestinians to negotiate, because they can just wait for Israel to be strangled by the world? I guess I think that's what the question means. That's how I interpret it anyhow. Luckily, I would say that Israel is not being treated like apartheid South Africa, nor should they be, because they're not an apartheid state, far from it. You know, I just looked at some statistics that about 10% of Israeli Arabs consider themselves, when they're asked, how do you self-identify? This is a new poll that just came out. About 10%, roughly, I think more than 10%, of Israeli Arabs who were asked, how do you identify? As Palestinian, as Israeli Arab, as Israeli, 10% plus said Israeli, and over 50% said Israeli Arab. In fact, many Israeli Arabs are proud to be Israelis, just as sort of being part of the winning team. I mean, they look around themselves and they see Lebanon is a mess. They see Syria as a horrible mess, a terrible tragedy in which 1 million people or more have been expelled and hundreds of thousands have been murdered. It's hardly a country anymore. You see Iraq, a total mess. You see Jordan under a lot of stress. I mean, Jordan, I believe, has 1 million refugees that they're trying to house, which is almost impossible. One of the elements of our foreign policy should be as much help for Jordan as possible. I wish we helped them more, because they have to supply food and water to 1 million refugees, and they don't even have enough water for themselves. So they look around at all the Arab countries and they see, you know, Egypt, they had a Muslim Brotherhood takeover and then a coup. And they think, I'm glad I'm living in Israel. Because in Israel, I'm free, I have a very healthy economy, I have lots of opportunities, I can go shopping, I can live my life, my children can grow up in freedom, they can go to school, they can become doctors, they can do anything they want pretty much. If they want to join the IDF, they can. They're not even drafted compared to Israeli Jews and the Druze Arab community, D-R-U-Z-E, I'm saying, I know it sounds like Jews, but the Druze Arab community, the men are drafted, Israeli Jews are drafted. The Israeli Arabs, non-Druze, are not even drafted, so they have the best of all worlds. So I would say that is the answer to the question. Israel is not losing that PR war around the world. There is a PR war, but Israel's not losing it. In fact, less and less, I would say, Israel is winning it. BDS is not winning. When you look at direct foreign investment in Israel, companies are voting with their feet. You see investment after investment after investment from companies around the world, from Microsoft, from Intel, from Warren Buffett, the world's greatest investor. You see Israeli companies. There's getting some noise in the background, so I don't know. We have to see who that is. Sorry about that. So Israel is not losing that war. So I think the question in a way is kind of moot, because Israel's not losing that war. Israel is not being viewed as apartheid South Africa.
Sorry, there are Canadian geese outside and they're having fights. That's the background noise. Okay. Always at the most inopportune times. Okay. So I think we're running out of time. So the last question that I have is from Zach S. Will Israel be committing a violation of international law if it extends its sovereignty to the settlements and the Jordan Valley?
That's a good question. As I said, Israel, there's evolving standard in international law. In the 1940s and 1950s, there was the idea that if you took territory as the result of a defensive war, then you could claim it. So for instance, parts of Germany during World War II were awarded to Poland after the war because of Germany's aggressive actions during World War II, because of its criminal actions during World War II. Parts of Germany were annexed to Poland. There were parts of Finland that were annexed to Russia because of the fact that Finland started the war. They didn't start the war. They began the war on the Nazi side. That evolving standard evolved and changed, so to the idea that that even in a defensive war, you didn't gain rights to sovereignty. However, as I said, Israel has its own sovereign claims in the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza, I guess, is moot, but in the West Bank, Israel has sovereign claims based on the Palestine Mandate, which was an international legal instrument passed by the League of Nations, inherited and essentially ratified in a sense by the United Nations. And it has legal standing, and it calls for, quote unquote, close settlement of Jews on the land, close quote. So in that sense, because of the Palestine Mandate, the Jews have sovereignty claims in the West Bank. And there are those legal experts who have argued that Israel has better sovereignty claims than other people on the West Bank, than anybody else on the West Bank, any other entity on the West Bank. The Israelis, however, of course, don't talk about annexing the entire West Bank. They talk about a peaceful resolution, some sort of agreement. But they want to put those Israeli communities on the West Bank under Israeli sovereignty at this point now, essentially, because of what's happened in the last 20 years. What is the point of continuing with an Oslo process when the Palestinians show no sign of taking it seriously? I think the Israeli point of view is, let's show the Palestinians and let's make it clear that there's a price to be paid for not making peace, that you don't get the international right of do-over, that if you don't make peace, there is a penalty, and that penalty is part of the land that you thought you might have claim to, that you thought would be part of the negotiations, are not going to be part of the negotiations. That land is gone. We're going to claim that as sovereign territory. And then we can discuss other parts of the territory for a sovereign Palestinian state if that day ever comes, that the Palestinians actually take it seriously and really reach a peace agreement with Israel. So in that sense, I think because of the mandate, that Israeli sovereignty, claiming sovereignty, annexing those territories, those parts of the West Bank, would not be illegal even under existing international law.
Awesome. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I want to say a huge thank you to you, Alex. This was wonderful. I'm so glad that we were able to do this despite coronavirus, despite being stuck at home, all that fun stuff. Well, not fun, but and thank you everyone for being here and participating. It really means a lot to me. If you have any lasting questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I love answering questions, and I'm also able to answer questions about the Camera Fellowship. Camera is still accepting applicants all the way up to June 1st. And if you become a fellow, you get this cool swag, like this awesome jacket I'm wearing. It's embroidered, it's amazing. Shout out to our wonderful co-sponsors, GMU AEPi, Friends of Israel at Virginia Tech, George Mason Chabad on Campus, Mason Hillel, and of course, our wonderful organization Camera, and then my Israel group, Israel Student Association at George Mason. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Absolutely. Great.